Welcome, everyone. It's Angelo Robles to the Angelo Robles podcast. I'm also the founder and CEO at Family Office Association. Today, we're going to feature Investing in Psychedelics, a conversation with MindMed. It features Rob Barrow, CEO, and Dan Karlin, who's the Chief Medical Officer of MindMed, which is a public company. It's really excited to have both of these gentlemen on. Rob and Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Angelo.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Well, this has certainly been a subject that both myself and investors and family offices have been interested in from a variety of different perspectives. Again, it's a pleasure to have you on. Why don't we start maybe first with you, Dan, then I would like, Rob, then we'll get Dan's feedback. What attracted you to work as an executive in the psychedelic space? I'm assuming you didn't graduate college and say, this is exactly the industry that I want to be involved in, or maybe you did. So what kind of led you down this journey?
I think this is true for both Dan and I, and speaks to the strategy that we have for MindMed, which is we are drug developers. We come out of the pharmaceutical industry, and we very much view the psychedelic opportunity as a unique one, sort of once in a lifetime chance to pick up a class of drugs that have been shunned from development for many, many years. A lot of the early academic research reignited this field. And as you look for ways to have positive impacts in our profession, this is a particularly unique opportunity. And so neither of us came particularly from a psychedelic angle, more from a pharma side of things. And as opportunities arose, and as certainly for myself, I left a position about 2 years ago as the chief operating officer of a clinical stage development company working on immunology pathways. And an opportunity arose to lead research and development for USONA Institute. I took that opportunity, had some successes while there, and then ultimately moved over to MindMed, given the high level alignment and strategy and opportunity to really have the kind of impact that a publicly traded, well-funded company can have.
Of course, that makes sense. And Dan, how about you?
Yeah, it's funny, Rob and I only met once we'd both taken our jobs. And it is amazing to have met someone whose view on these things aligns so nicely with mine, and truly his path here as well. So I'm a psychiatrist by training. I also boarded in addictions and clinical informatics, and have split time over the years of my career between care delivery, technology for care delivery, digital therapeutics, digital medicine, and time at Pfizer spent working on psychiatric drugs. So when the opportunity came along to include a lot of the digital technology I've been working on at my previous company, alongside these really exciting mechanisms that we see in the drugs that we've come to via the psychedelic route, it felt like a perfect combination. It's not often that you get to work on developing a drug in psychiatry that's extremely likely to work based on all of the pre-existing evidence. So there's something to be said for just getting to work on drugs that look like they work very well, and work across a number of different conditions. It's about as good a place as a drug developer you can be in. And then to think about how do we build technologies and other enabling functions alongside that, is a pretty great opportunity.
Yeah, no, that's a very good overview from the doctor's perspective. And Dan, maybe we'll stick with you on the next question to begin. Where do you see the future of psychedelics as medicine evolving?
Yeah, it's one of the challenges, I think, for folks looking at investing in the space, looking at psychedelics, who haven't been in biotech before. And there's certainly a lot of folks like that. They see this really exciting space. They see drugs likely to work. They see companies that have done a really nice job of getting the word out to the investor community. Biotech is hard, and it takes a while. So when I talk about a future for psychedelics, the next step in that future is probably still years away, which is our first regulatory approvals, right? The first of these drugs that will be able to go to market as medicines. And even to get there, we're talking 3 to 5 years of just work time where our companies have to do the hard work of getting drugs approved. Beyond that, beyond those first approvals, I think we learn a lot on the path there. And then we, like many of the other companies working in this space, are already thinking about what might that next generation of psychedelic, and we use the phrase psychedelic inspired, but starting with these mechanisms that had been put on the shelf for a long time for a lot of reasons that didn't have a whole lot to do with science or efficacy, starting with those mechanisms, getting them approved, learning what we learned by bringing these medicines into really good randomized clinical studies. Well, what do we learn on the way that helps us develop the next generation of drugs? Because like any other class of drugs, the first ones to become medicines are unlikely to have optimal characteristics for their ongoing use. So already we're thinking, okay, here's the path to get our first pipeline entrance approved. What does the pipeline look like behind that? And we hope that we expect that it will be filled with molecules that have better characteristics and more specific, perhaps, characteristics to aim at different disease areas, both in psychiatry and beyond psychiatry.
Excellent. And although that was a very detailed overview, Rob, anything from your perspective to add to that?
Yeah, from my vantage, there's been so much excitement and such a story that is born a lot out of legacy and a lot out of the academic studies that have been conducted. The future and the vision that I know Dan and I and we as an organization share, though, is that we need to be developing psychedelics in a way that is not a square peg in a round hole. So you hear a lot of stories and a lot of marketing pitches about how we need to completely overhaul the mental health care system and effectively come up with an entirely new model of delivery that doesn't exist today. I'm all for ambitious lists. I'm all for dreaming. We approach it that is certainly the ultimate goal here, but we need to do it in an iterative fashion over time. And primarily what we need to do now is construct the drug development programs and ultimate approvals by regulatory authorities that allow us to roll these out into the ecosystem that exists. To use an analogy, I'll say, when we have electric cars, we don't say, well, we should tear up all the roads and rebuild the roads. We say, let's put some charging stations, on off ramps. We need to do the same thing with this space, and I see the future as being particularly positive for psychedelics. Certainly, it's a great opportunity, a lot of promising data. Now it's time for organizations like ourselves to take that next step and ultimately figure out how we roll this out in a better way, but in the current ecosystem that already exists.
The opioid crisis is a major problem. What can you tell us about I believe it's known as the 18MC program in Australia, and are there any hurdles on getting something like this implemented in North America?
Yeah, so I think just to clarify too, for our 18MC development program, we had a nice opportunity to accelerate our phase 1 clinical trials going to Australia. The main geographic focus for us is the United States, and certainly as we progress, looking to Europe. As we move forward in the development program, the main regulatory market for approval would be in the United States, and certainly there's a huge problem. Dan, as a addiction medicine doctor, can speak thoroughly to this even more than I can, but there are a number of hurdles to rolling out any new medication, but we see an enormous opportunity. We have compelling preclinical data that suggests we have a great asset here to alleviate some of the issues with the opioid crisis, and ultimately we see a huge market opportunity and a huge public health benefit if we're successful in that effort.
And Dan, anything to add to that?
I mean, Rob's summary was right on, and the opioid death crisis, which is really where we're at right now, right? It went from an opioid use crisis, but with the advent of really widespread synthetic high potency opioids in the drug supply, in the illicit drug supply, the death rate is just sort of untenable, and obviously anything that can help there is necessary. The one advantage of our molecule in development is that it's not an agonist therapy. So while most of the efficacious drugs for opioid use, buprenorphine and methadone, work on the same receptor that opioids do, which is not intrinsically good, bad, or otherwise, it just happens to be how they work. And Vivitrol, of course, antagonizes that receptor, so it blocks it. So either blocking or activating the receptor that opioids do, 18-MC works via a different mechanism. And so anytime you have any disease that is responsive to a medicine, but maybe not as responsive as you'd like it to be, being able to bring another mechanism into play offers hope that you'll be able to help folks who didn't get enough benefit from the existing mechanisms.
And MindMed acquired Health Mode, a digital medicine and therapeutic startup that uses AI-enabled digital measurement to increase the precision and speed of clinical research and patient monitoring. What is the future of, I would say, the intersection of human psychedelics and technology?
Yeah, I guess I'll speak to that first because I came over in the Health Mode acquisition. Bradford Cross and I founded Health Mode in 2018, based on this idea of a really a new field of study called digital medicine, which is how do we use these technologies that are around us all the time, measuring us anyway, how do we use those to change both clinical trials, clinical studies, and also clinical care. And the entire hypothesis here is that many of the diseases we're interested in psychiatry, in systemic illness, even in things like pain, are defined by their signs and symptoms. They're defined by how people feel and the sorts of things they're able to do, right? Signs and symptoms. And that our current ways of measuring signs and symptoms aren't that good across a lot of these disease areas, right? We can measure things like blood pressure, which is a sign, and we've developed a technology to do that. And you can almost think of blood pressure as being an early digital biomarker, right? It takes an analog signal that's a part of the person and it turns it into numbers. That's fundamentally what being digital means, is you take some signal and you make numbers out of it. And we think of the Health Mode and now the integrated Albert division of MindMed being similar. If you use measurement technology and measure folks more times, more consistently, more in the real world, and more while they're going about their normal lives, and then use those measurements to start to build models to understand the illnesses, you'll get to models that are more representative of reality than previous models, right? That's how we interact with disease all the time, is by constructing mental models of it and then engaging with those models, because the diseases themselves are so complicated. So what we see in the integrated company is the opportunity to bring all of those digital medicine concepts to bear on the diseases that we're interested in developing drugs for. Now, does that mean that tomorrow we're going to run off and throw some experimental measure in an FDA-facing trial? Like, no, like absolutely not. Part of the exuberance for digital medicine has to come from recognizing that there's a lot of work to be done, and that these devices have been on folks for a while, and we're not, just from people wearing them and looking at massive swaths of data, we haven't necessarily learned a lot about people. So the Health Mode approach is much more laser-like. It's, can we look very closely at specific signs and symptoms over time and start to form subcategorization of diseases and trend prediction based on those observations, and then bring that novel kind of measurement to bear at the right stage in the right place, either in clinical trials, in clinical studies that sit outside of our clinical trials, or in enabling clinical care.
And MindMed has initiated or is initiating studies to evaluate potential treatments to help patients with ADHD, anxiety, cluster headaches, and substance abuse. What has been the biggest takeaways from these studies so far?
I think when we look to studies that we are going to be launching, and a lot of the studies we've purchased rights to the data and done through collaborations historically, there's certainly a lot of learning mechanistically of how these drugs work, of how to administer them, and how to ultimately focus the treatments in a way that allows us to accelerate our development programs. So much of the history of LSD, we have over 1,000 patients historically have been administered LSD in clinical research studies dating back to the 1950s. As Dan said earlier, this gives us an incredible look compared to most drug development programs into the safety profile, into ways that it can be administered. And certainly if we were looking at LSD fresh for the first time and had never put it in a human, and we dosed someone without knowing what the psychological effects might be, we would be sitting here going, oh my gosh, what do we do with this? How in the world could we administer this? there's so much history there. There's so much learning from us and our collaborators that it gives us a really convenient way to take those development programs forward and put them through a rigorous FDA and clinical trial development process.
And according to some companies in the space, when administered as an ayahuasca brew, DMT can prolong experiential effects and slow metabolism. Can this substance help with addiction disorders, Dan?
So there are a few different concepts wrapped up in that question.
Yes.
So DMT usually thought of not in combination as a very short-acting psychedelic, which again, with all that we know and don't know, there's some hope that DMT may have ameliorative effects on psychiatric disorders, on addiction disorders. That hasn't been adequately tested to date, and we don't really know whether that short duration of action is long enough, too long. There's plenty of unanswered questions. What we do know is that the ayahuasca combination, which itself, it's not DMT brewed into something, it just is a combination that contains DMT and a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, which happens to also be a class of drugs that has existed in psychiatry for a really long time as an antidepressant separate from any role to do with psychedelics, is that when you give DMT via a route, it can be absorbed with the MAOI, it lasts an awful lot longer. And so the main difference between DMT used without an MAOI or DMT used as a component of ayahuasca with an MAOI seems to be the duration of that experience. And of course, that duration brings with it potential efficacy. It also brings side effects. So this is one of those situations where there's a lot of what we would call anecdotal evidence, which isn't to dismiss that people's experiences are in any way invalid, by the way. So we'll say anecdotal evidence, we'll say historical evidence. It doesn't detract from what any individual may have sustained as a benefit or take away from their side effects if they had them, right? That experience was their own. But one of the hallmarks of sort of this modern development effort and a modern approach to the regulators is the anecdotal evidence is more of hypothesis generation for us. So we look at things that are in the literature that people have written about their own experiences, the historical studies in the 50s and 60s before it was more or less shut down, even the experiments that continued in the interim. And we look at that and we say, okay, this asks a great question. And then to answer that question definitively, we think about how would we design a well-controlled, randomized clinical trial that would actually get at a more definitive answer to that question. And so, far from dismissing anecdotal evidence, it's the genesis of a lot of the most interesting questions we can ask.
And Rob, I'm going to give you one of my Angelo crazy questions. If you had indeed. If you had a silver bullet and could take out any of your competitors, which one would it be and why?
So I'll give you an equally silly answer to that. Well, no, it's if I've learned anything from it's about to be July 4th. If I've learned anything from watching Hamilton, it's the honorable thing to do is to fire high and not aim it at anybody. So I'd say that. I mean, I think this is a small space. There's certainly plenty of room for a number of psychedelics. Yes, there's competition. Competition is healthy. It makes life fun in many ways. But a rising tide here lifts all ships, and we very much see it that way. We're friends with the folks in various organizations. I would compare it to when you watch the NFL, we compete, and then end of the day we sit down and shake hands and hope everyone is we're all in this for the same reason, which is to bring a class of drugs forward that can really provide a unique opportunity to provide relief for mental health crisis. That's not geographically bound. It's not limited to one indication. And it's certainly not going to be cured by just one of these molecules. So there's a lot of promise here. There's plenty of room in this together, and we hope that we can all be successful and all work together in meaningful ways to help accelerate all the treatments forward.
And Dr. Dan Karlin, you're not going to get away without one of the relatively unique questions as well. If we are living in a simulation, what psychedelic drug are we naturally experiencing?
So at some level, really, this may be a largely unsatisfying answer. So our brain itself is filled with neurotransmitters, right? I mean, here's where this actually gets interesting. And this is why psychiatry is so interesting to me. It's why psychedelics are so interesting to me, is we have a few exogenous substances that come from the world that we can put into our bodies via various mechanisms that cause us to have experiences, sometimes distinct, sometimes not super distinct, right? You don't feel a lot when you take Tylenol, but we at this point know that even taking Tylenol can change psychiatric perception of events. So the exogenous substances we have, these few classical psychedelics, the relatively few medicines that have been invented, just pale in comparison to the immense and enormous chemical and electrical complexity of our brain. So whether we're in a simulation or not, our brains are firing away doing their things. And whether it's because of real exogenous stimulation or stimulated exogenous stimulation, I don't know, our brains would work all that differently. So we are being bathed in things that if you were given a large exogenous dose, you would feel really distinctly something. But in tiny little doses, in tiny little packets, in isolated regions of your brain, it makes you you. And this exercise, as Rob finished saying, the exercise here is not, doesn't necessarily have to be large and philosophical. The exercise here is people, for whatever the reason, are suffering. And these drugs, these mechanisms, and the mechanisms that follow after them seem to alleviate that in one way or another. And so all of this is about letting those little packets of neurotransmitters, psychedelic or not, in your brain, be balanced a little bit better to help you feel more like you and be happy with who you are.
No, that's a very good answer. One of our live listeners said, effectively, Angelo, you had psychedelics as a topic covered for family offices a couple of months ago, and there were two questions that kind of stood out. They want me to repeat those questions to you. Maybe the first one is a little bit more Rob-centric, the second one probably a little more for Dan, but I'll leave either of you to tackle them, then we'll do a wrap-up. Does the psychedelic experience, I found it in my questions, by the way, does the psychedelic experience put you in a new dimension, similar to as Terence McKenna stated, or is the entire experience a product of the user's mind?
Oh, this may be a question for both of us. I'm sure Dan, as a psychiatrist, has lots to say about the latter part of that question. So much about the psychedelic experience, the psychoactivity and the perceptual changes that happen after administering psychedelics are yet to be fully understood, and it can be understood in many different constructs. But one of my favorite, and I'll hope he doesn't mind me borrowing this story, but one of my favorite stories from one of our academic friends out there is Peter Hendricks, who is at UAB and has done a lot of work with a lower income population, looking at cocaine use and cocaine abuse and treating it with psilocybin. And what he has shared historically is that some patients will come in and sit down on the couch and say, oh, I'm certain I got the placebo, but while I was laying there, Jesus walked in the room and told me that I should stop using cocaine, and so I'm going to be clean now. So much of this is certainly going to come forth based on your personal background and historical frame of reference for how you think about the world at large. That's not the realm of medicine or drug development, certainly, to get into the religious components, but if we believe that the psychoactivity, the perceptual changes in some way mediate that clinical response, certainly it's going to be individual and in that way sort of constructed based on your prior beliefs and frame of reference for the world at large.
And Dan, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'm always surprised when people say just from your mind. This is the most like we get to walk around as like a carrying device for the most complicated thing that is in the known universe. Like that, it's enough if it comes from your mind. That's amazing. We humans wandered around the world for 300,000 years before we stopped hunting and gathering and figured out that we could farm. It took another 20 to 30,000 years to get here. Our brain is the product of all of that time spent learning how to be what we are today. So I tend to take a very modest Like, we dispensed with dualism, the brain and the body, it's all part of the same thing. It's an incredibly complex, amazing machine that, you could go back to the very beginnings of sort of psychodynamic psychotherapy and talk about Freud helping people get past their defense mechanisms. We still do that today. And so we often dispense with the parts of our brain we don't have easy access to, because of course it's hard to think that you have all that in you and you don't have access to it. But just from the brain, it's better than almost anywhere else I can think of something coming from.
For sure. And I believe my final question, probably a little more for Dan, but Rob, certainly feel free to jump in. Do humans produce DMT naturally? And does this explain how we dream? And does this explain the profundity of near-death experiences?
So certainly there's evidence that there's DMT in there. And these receptors, I mean, the interesting thing is when you get exogenous drugs and they do things in the brain, those receptors were there for a reason, because they were doing things with endogenous signaling anyway. So most of what we do to the brain with exogenous compounds is just overemphasizing one receptor set over another. So yeah, absolutely. Does it explain dreaming? I don't know. I mean, we, despite having thought a lot about dreaming for a long time, are not great at knowing why we dream, but that's almost okay because we also don't even know why we sleep. So there's a lot that remains to be solved. We don't know why we're doing what we do a third of the day. Arguably, a lot of us don't know why we're doing the other 2/3. But yeah, the profundity of near-death experiences. If I had a dream and then woke up and you told me I was dead while I had that dream, I think I'd reflect on it pretty profoundly as well. So we do a lot of post hoc explanation in our worlds, and that's great if it helps you to feel better and to experience the world in a more unified, more robust way that makes you feel better about being you. So might it be related? Sure. Does it matter that much? Maybe not.
And Robert, for those that would like to learn more about the groundbreaking work that MindMed is doing, of course, it's a public company, and maybe do a little bit more understanding of it so they can become more knowledgeable, both maybe internally for issues of themselves or someone they may know, or simply looking at it from an investing perspective. How could they learn more?
Yeah, we encourage you to head to our website as a starting point, mindmed.co. We're certainly happy to be engaged with investors and have any discussions as appropriate about our organization and our strategy and where we're going. We have, certainly as a public company, earnings calls and presentations. We attend a lot of the major biotech conferences and are out there in the wider world in press and podcasts, and always happy to engage as an extension of those. So there is the starting point, and then certainly as we progress into clinical trials, all of that will be registered on public registries, clinicaltrials.gov. We'll certainly be building out components of our website and various research websites to point people in the right direction to participate in those studies as we get to that point in our development.
Excellent. It really has been a pleasure. It's been an intriguing subject for me, my members, my listeners and viewers. I hope they enjoyed it. Everyone, I'm Angelo Robles. I'm the host of the Angelo Robles podcast and founder and CEO at Family Office Association, a global membership organization dedicated to family offices. You can learn more about us on our website, simply familyofficeassociation.com. We're also, and I am also, very active in social media, Family Office Association, where I have done some posts on investing in psychedelics on Instagram of all platforms, where I'm actually pretty active. So again, we're Family Office Association on Instagram. And my YouTube platform is simply Family Office. You could find us. Thank you, everyone, for viewing or listening in, whatever it may be. And certainly thank you, Rob and Dan, for being great guests. I wish you all the best and look forward to our future follow-up.
Thanks so much, Angelo.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.